Hi, I'm Chef Mike Palazzolo at East Central College, and we're working together with the Missouri Department of Conservation on a video series on how to fabricate your deer and a couple of different recipes on how to prepare your deer. So today I'm going to start with the fabrication, and you see here in front of me I have a nice little deer that the Missouri Department of Conservation has provided for us. And what I'm going to do is kind of break this animal down from head to tail and kind of talk about the different cuts that we're going to feature in our recipes as I go. As we do that, I want to kind of talk to you a little bit about some of the things that have been done to this deer before I even start the fabrication. So this deer was part of the culling process and was brought into us and skinned on premise by our biology teacher, Kevin Dixon. And he's done a great job with that and provided us with a nice clean carcass. So what I've done is I've put this in a brine, which is a mixture of salt, sugar, and water. And it's a typical 3-2-1, which is 3 gallons of water, 2 pounds of salt, 1 pound of sugar. And that should give it it should remove any of the gaminess that's still residing in the meat. It helps make the product a little bit more wholesome by killing any bacteria that might be in there. And it also extracts a lot of nutrients that people sometimes regard as blood, but that is just minerals and nutrients still, you know, in the muscle system. So the brine also helps pull that out as well, and it just leaves a cleaner taste for the venison. You know, I know a lot of people who say, I don't like the gamey flavor of it. Well, the gamey flavor, in my mind, that's a choice. That there are steps you can take to remove as much of that as possible to make this taste very similar to a lean steak of beef. So for those of us who are saying, oh, I don't like venison, well, give it a chance. So first thing I'm going to do that not a lot of hunters do, when they break this down in the field, a lot of hunters just remove these back straps as a whole piece. What I do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to quarter this animal. So I'm going to have my front quarter, which is going to include my legs and my neck. I'm going to have my 8-bone rack, and I'm going to have my loin, and I'm going to have my hindquarter. Okay? The reason I do this is so I can keep those bones in my 8-bone rack. Okay? If I were to just rip them out this way, that'd be fine. I'm going to end up with a nice long back strap, as it's called. But for my money, I want to be able to show off the rib bones a little bit and do a bone-in chop. So to do that, I have to go ahead and quarter it up. So what I'm going to do is start there. What I do there is make a cut right between the 4th and the 5th bone, okay? And that's right about there to right about there. Same thing on the other side, right in between that 4th or 5th bone. And then what I'm going to do with my handsaw here is come in, saw through that rib cage. Okay. And then saw right through that backbone there. Once I'm through that backbone, I'm going to come back with my knife and just go ahead and cut that little guy off there. All right, so here's my first quarter, okay? And you'll notice that obviously there's 2 sides to the deer. So I'm gonna have basically 2 steaks coming out of the right leg and 2 steaks coming out of the left leg. And then I'm going to take those steaks and further fabricate them into what I would look at as carnitas, okay? So a nice thin piece that I can saute up with some peppers and onions and serve for later. So I'm going to leave that there for a minute. I'm going to come in here and make my second cut, And again, I want to keep an 8-bone rack, so I count down the rib bones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8. And through. And 8. And through. Okay, and I'll do the same thing here. And just cut through that backbone. There we go. There's my rib portion. And then I'll come back here to my loin, okay? And that's that center cut, and that's, you know, that's going to be a nice chunk of your back straps, okay? Then we'll come in here, and right in front of this hind leg is where I'm going to make that cut, okay? And that you can kind of tell from the inside here, I have my tenderloins, okay? At the head of the tenderloin, right down here towards the tail end, is where I want to make that cut. So I'm going to come in here. And make that cut. All right, so I've got my animal quartered. Now it's a little bit smaller, it's a little bit easier to manage for me. But before I move on, I want to kind of talk about things a little bit. So from the front quarter, again, I'm going to remove some of these nice roasts from the front legs, and they're going to provide a nice thin steak that I'm able to cut some carnitas out of. Again, nice thin strips, good for sauteing. So that's going to be the recipe featured from the front. 8-bone rack, we're doing a nice double bone chop that we're throwing on the grill, and we're serving that with a little whipped mashed potatoes and a little chimichurri sauce. So that's what we're going to get out of here. From the loin, we're going to do a little bit of a more complicated dish, and we're going to feature a bacon wrapped loin. We're going to serve that with a little creamed spinach. So, and then back here, from the hindquarter, we're going to be taking some of these larger eye muscles out of the hindquarter, and what we're going to do with those is we're going to pound them thin with a meat mallet, and those are going to be our chicken fried steaks. So, but again, what I want to do, I'm going to start from the front and work my way back. And for filming purposes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do half of the animal now and half of the animal off camera. So, but I'm going to be doing the same thing to both sides. So let's move this out of my way. Something I like to have when I'm butchering is I like to have a bench scraper. This allows me to keep my board scraped off and clean, especially when you get into some bigger deers where they have that, you know, nice hefty layer of fat on them. That fat kind of gets on your cutting board and makes it all slimy and hard to keep things still, so make things a little bit difficult. All right, so what I'm going to do here, like I said, I'm getting these little blade steaks off of this front quarter here, and all I'm trying to do is separate that leg, and this gets a little tough because as you can see, this is the, I believe that would be the exit wound. The entry wound would have been on the other side. So there's going to be a little bit of trauma to that part of the animal. All right. All right, so one leg. And again, I'm doing the same thing to the other side. I think I would like to use this leg better. When I'm butchering, I tend to use the front part of my knife, and that will give me a lot of control, okay? I do a lot of seam butchering, which means, as you can see right there, there's a layer of fat and sinew in between both of the eye muscles, okay? So I'm able to kind of flick my knife in there, pull things apart. Just separate things a little bit so that I can see in there, so I can work in there. So there's both legs. I'm going to go ahead and reserve this. We are not featuring it, but what a lot of people like to do is there's a neck roll up here. If I were to bone out this section of the neck, it actually makes for a very tender piece of meat when I go ahead and stew it or braise it. All right, so I'm coming to these front quarters, and what I'm trying to do is, you can feel here on that shoulder blade, there's a little muscle over here, there's a bone running there, and there's a little muscle down here. I'm going to remove both of those muscles in the hopes that they're going to give me enough meat to do my carnitas. Okay, so again, I'm only really using the tip of this knife. And what I'm doing is I'm tracing down that bone till I hit another bone. Once I hit another bone, I have to change directions. Okay, and because I have a little bit of knowledge of the makeup of this animal, I know that it changes directions and goes straight to my right. So what I do is just kind of level out that knife so that I can cut in that direction. Work my way around any knee. Okay, so there's a little steak there that I can get some carnitas out of. I'm going to finish cleaning it up, and then cutting on the other side, a little bit larger eye muscle. Again, using the first inch and a half of that knife, I cut down to that shoulder blade. The knife stops because it's hitting bone, and then I change directions. And then basically what I'll do from there after I've changed directions is just take nice little swipes at it, okay? And my knife is kind of following along that bone. Each time cutting off a little bit more. Each time cutting off a little bit more. All right, so where's my joint? And then I look, my eye muscle ends right there. Okay, so I got a little eye muscle there. I want to kind of trim off as much of that sinew as I can. Again, that sinew is, kind of where venison takes on its gamey flavor. So as much of that as we can remove, we want to. Again, if this is a deer you harvested yourself, generally it's going to have an exit and an entry wound that you'll have to pay attention to and kind of remove any clotted blood, any meat that has trauma to it. So, and then remove this little eye muscle. And anything we're not featuring in our recipes, has the potential to be ground up for sausages, for just hamburger, what have you. So I'm going to go ahead and reserve that over there. We've removed our muscles from our front quarter, and we're going to finish fabricating these so they're ready for our carnitas. I'm going to remove any silver skin that's still left on there. Okay, any fat that you see that's hanging on there that might be kind of slimy, that's where we're going to get that nasty flavor from. So we want to remove that as best we can. Okay. Remove any sinew, that'll make it tough. All right, and then I'm left with a nice eye muscle, and what I'm going to do is, carnitas are a very quick cook time. So we want to make sure we cut them nice and thin. So I'm going to cut them on a bias nice and thin, so they're ready for us to saute up. All right, so I'm trying to keep these as thin as possible. All right, and once I get a nice little pile of these, that's gonna be for our carnitas, okay? But again, it's those nice little front shoulder muscles, okay? I got 2 steaks coming off of that shoulder blade, one smaller than the other, but both of them very good, usable meat, very appropriate for that quick cook time, for very high heat, so they lend very well to the carnita style of cooking. All right, so we're gonna finish that up off camera to get ready for our carnitas video. Moving on to our next cut, here we have our loin, and what I want you guys to see here is that's basically my back strap here with the backbone in the middle, okay? So leaving the bones in on the rack is going to give me another approach to it, being that I can leave the bone in as I cook it, okay, which adds flavor, it adds visual appearance. So to do that, again, this is the trauma where my arrow went through, so I'm going to cut a lot of that away. Okay, that's a lot of clotted meat or clotted blood on our meat, so I want to remove as much of that as possible. And then I'm going to start thinking about my 8-bone rack. And when I think about that, I got to think about how long those bones are. How long do I want them to be? And typically, you know, I want to make it manageable on the plate for the customer. So what I'm typically going to do is cut them about 6 inches long. Okay. Tough to make sure your rib bones are staying still. If they move around on you, they're harder to cut. So if you have a buddy, have your buddy come over and hold it at this point. There we go. So I've removed the extra rib bones that I'm not going to be able to use. And then what I want to do is I want to cut that spinal cord out of there, okay? But still keep those rib bones intact. So to do that, I come in here and I get as close to that spinal cord as possible. And what I want to make sure I'm not doing is I don't want to cut into that, okay? I want to basically cut right there and come to the middle of that backbone here, okay? And this is probably one of the toughest cuts you got to make. If you have a bandsaw, that'll make your life a lot easier. Most of what's hard about it is just getting everything to sit still and allow you to get in the right angles to cut it. So there we go. All right, so I think I've cut through that bone. So the rest of the work can pretty much be done with my knife. Okay. little bit more. All right. And it's also one of those things that it's real easy to go too far. So you want to get very close to getting through that bone and then start being gentle with it again. There we go. All right. All right, do a little more trimming here on this one. Again, that's where my entry and exit wound happened, so there's a lot of clotted blood there. So I'm gonna go ahead and focus in on this guy here. This one's a little bit cleaner for us. And as you guys can see, I have my eye muscle there nicely intact. I got my 8 bones on here. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is come back. I'm gonna remove a lot of this meat from the top of the bones by starting at the top of the eye muscle, okay? At the end of the day, you wanna make sure you're not cutting into any of your feature pieces. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna slide my knife down each one of those rib bones until I remove that little 1/4 inch of meat and fat from the top of them. Okay, and what you got now is you got a better look at your bones, okay? I'm gonna take that another step further and I'm gonna come back in between the bones. And I'm gonna remove that. Okay? And again, this just allows me to show off a little bit, okay? I got these nice bones on there. Let's highlight them a little bit. Okay? So we're gonna come back in between each set of ribs and kind of scoop that chunk out. Okay? After we're done with that, I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to scrape using the back of my knife. I'm sorry, the bottom of my knife, okay? So to cut, I use this part. To scrape bones, I use that part. Okay, and then I'll take my towel and I'll kind of grab a hold of that meat that I've scraped up. Yeah, if I can get a nice hold on it there. All that meat that I've scraped up, I'll try and grab a hold of and pull it down. And by pulling it down, it should just come off that bone nice and clean. Okay? So that all I'm left with is the bone. I don't want to have a lot of meat and connective tissue left on those bones because as I cook them, they're going to burn. That's not very visually appealing, which kind of defeats the purpose. At that point, why don't you just rip the back straps all the way out? So if this wasn't a focal point of mine, that's probably what I would do. So again, scrape those down. Scrape, scrape, scrape. And sometimes it's tough to get a hold of. Fortunately, when you get these nice young little deer like that, the connective tissue that's holding all the meat to the rib bones isn't as developed, so it's a little bit easier to rip off, hypothetically. I'm not having a great time with it right now. All right, but we just want that to look as clean as possible there on our bones. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this fat cap here. Typically what I look to do is anything that's going to fall off when I cook it, I want to take it off beforehand. Okay, so this being separated by this membrane here kind of leads me to believe that it's not going to stay on during the whole cook time. Okay, this will also allow me to get a little bit cleaner than I would if I were just leaving it on. Okay, and again, I do a lot of seam butchery, so you know, even though I have the knife and I use the knife, a lot of this is done by hand, okay? You're doing a lot of pulling, you're separating a lot of eye muscles just by, you know, applying a little bit of tension to them. Okay, so we're going to try and get that as cleaned up as possible. Finish up my bone. All right, and then at this point, once I've got my bones cleaned up, I got the option to cook this as a whole 8-bone rack, okay? At which point I'll come back and possibly slice them off of the rack. I can cut them as double bone chops, which is what I'm going to feature in the second day or second week of recipes. So we'll just go ahead and right now for storage purposes, I'm going to go ahead and leave them whole. After you cut them, they're a little bit more fragile. I would rather them go straight from being cut to being cooked rather than being cut and stored. So right now I have a nice little bone in rack. Then I'm going to come back and fabricate again into little double bone chops for our second recipe. And again, you know, I know it's butchery, it's kind of a messy job. I'm going to end up with blood all over my cutting board, but I do not want to have unnecessary chunks of meat, unnecessary chunks of fat, okay? I really try and impress how important it is to stay as clean as you can. Wipe down constantly, keep your tools clean and sharp. All right, and we're on to the loin. And the loin is probably one of my favorite cuts of the whole deer. For my money, it's probably some of the most flavorful meat. It's probably some of the most tender meat. And it's fairly easy to prepare, okay? So you notice, right here, this is my loin. Right there, that's my short loin, okay? In between, I have the vertebrate. In the middle, I have the spinal cord. Underneath, okay? These guys are a little worse for wear due to the placement of the kill shot, but these are our tenderloins, okay? The tenderloins are actually inside the animal, whereas the loin is outside the animal, okay? Both of them are gonna have great flavor, very tender, but like I said, for my money, I would prefer to focus on the loin. So for this recipe, we're gonna be doing a bacon wrapped loin. So what I'm going to do first is kind of trim off some of this fat. Okay. What I want to make sure I never do is I don't want to cut into this eye muscle, right? That eye muscle, that's my money. That's my good stuff right there. So, all right. So I have two loins, one on the right, one on the left, with the spinal cord or the backbone going right down the middle. So it's real easy. If you kind of move your fingers across there, you can see or feel where your line is. And what I'll do is I'll cut right down that line. And again, just trying to use that first inch, inch and a half of my knife, okay? I'm gonna cut all the way down that spinal column, or that backbone, until my knife stops. At that point, I gotta kind of change directions and cut back to my left. But then once I get around that spinal column again, I'll be able to cut back down. All right, and a lot of people don't take the effort to cut around that little spur in the backbone, and they lose a lot of meat. Okay, but just a little bit of discipline will get you there. It's not difficult to do per se. It actually fell on the table. All right, so I'm cutting down, and then once I reach the bottom, I'm once again going to change directions and follow that bone. Again, a lot of butchery is following seams of fat, following lines of bone, okay? And that's what's happening right now. I have followed the bone, cut all the way down until I hit bone. I got to stop. I got to change directions. I got to turn my knife. I got to cut in another direction, okay? Now that I'm just removing it from this loin, or removing the loin from the backbone, it's real easy to follow these bones right here. Okay, so there's one. We'll go ahead and take the other one off just for the heck of it. Okay, so again, one cut straight down. There's my vertebrae and my backbone right there. I'm cutting until I reach the bones. I can't cut down anymore. So I need to change the direction of my knife. Okay, and again, I'm just kind of following bone. And I'm only going to make that cut for about 1/4 of an inch before I can start going back down again. And if you can see on this side right here, okay, that's that little hump that I'm talking about cutting over that a lot of people are not doing. All right, and just that first inch or two of the knife. And what that really does is it kind of helps you from making big mistakes. Okay, I can't do a lot of damage if I'm only cutting with 1.5 inches of the knife, as opposed to using the whole thing. So again, I'm just going to kind of fire over that spur, and my knife hits bone again and it stops, and I got to change direction yet again. Just turn my knife and follow those bones once again. And there's both of my loins. Pretty clean on both sides. Flip it over, I got my tenderloins. Okay, and these would have been a little bit easier to take out if I'd have left that animal whole. They also would have been a little bit easier to take out if they were still intact all the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on the other side of these bones right here. And I'm just removing another eye muscle, okay? All right. So there's tenderloin number 1. And the tenderloins, again, very underdeveloped muscle, therefore it's very tender. So if you can get in there, a lot of that can just be kind of pulled out with your hands, okay? If it starts to tear the meat, get in there with your knife. All right, so I have a nice clean loin. And then what I'm left with here is going to be bacon wrapped later on. But before I bacon wrap it, I need to what's called denude it, okay? And in denuding, I want to remove any fat, any silver skin, anything that isn't that main eye muscle, okay? So in doing that, again, I'm going to go back to seam butchery. If you can kind of see in here, I have connective tissue holding the fat to the meat. That can really be separated a lot by your hands. If you get to a spot where you're doing more good than bad, bring the knife into the picture. Okay, but when it's all said and done, that little cap comes off of there. All right, so you see how I got to the very end and I was no longer able to pull it? At that point, I need to bring the knife into the picture. All right. So to finish off the loin, I want to take a look at it. I want to make sure it's nice and aesthetically pleasing. Cuts like this, these are your high-end cuts. This is where I take the opportunity to do kind of fun recipes, a little bit more involved recipes. So, all right, removing the silver skin. There is a tough layer of skin that, again, is holding that fat to the muscle. And I don't want my customers to have to eat that. So what I'll do is I'll take a small section of that silver skin up. I'll come up underneath it and I'll remove it. Okay? So again, take a small little bit of silver skin up, get underneath, and remove it. Okay? And again, once this cut of meat is all finished, it's going to have bacon wrapped all the way around it. I'm going to have to slice it, so I need to make sure it's a nice, even eye muscle. There's not any connective tissue in there. Every bite is very tender and juicy, so you got to take a little bit of extra care to make sure we get there. All right, a little bit of connective tissue on the bottom. I'm going to remove that. And then this meat that I'm trimming off is great for if you're making a venison stock. Some of it can be ground. I would caution anyone against grinding that meat that we have removed from the outside, as well as anything that has trauma to it. So if the animal was shot in a certain spot, there's a certain area around that you're going to want to cut away. If the animal was hit by a car, there's going to be a certain area that you're going to need to trim away. Okay? So right here, I have my beautiful loin. This is going to be bacon wrapped and cooked to a nice medium rare and cut nice little medallions out of it. So, and you can smell it. It just smells like nice, fresh venison. All right, so that brings me to the end of my loin. I'm just going to kind of let my tenderloins hang out over there. And that brings me to my hindquarter. And most hunters, most people that cook venison are familiar with the jerky, with the ground, with summer sausage, what have you. But I tried to feature recipes that were kind of out of the ordinary for venison. Trying to make a connection between other proteins that we already cook that we're familiar with, but just substituting venison in there. And that's very easy to do with so many of our recipes, okay? At the end of the day, this is a quadruped, Okay, they're all pretty much put together the same way. Lamb, beef, venison, okay, they're all going to have a very similar skeletal structure. So, all right, which brings me to the hind legs. And then when we get in here to the hind legs, we want to make sure that we're keeping those large muscles together, okay? We're keeping those large muscles whole. What I see a lot of people do is they just kind of look at this back end here and they just start going after cuts of meat, okay? Because they're going to grind the whole thing. Well, there's a lot of really nice roasts in here, okay? And what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to kind of take some of those roasts out. I'm going to cut nice little cutlets of it, and then I'm going to tenderize those cutlets to get a nice chicken fried steak, as you would. So what we're going to do first, just to make this easy on me, I'm going to cut this in half. All right, so one leg, two legs. And then what I want to do is I'm going to have, again, like I said, some larger roasts in here. We're going to do a chicken fried steak out of them, but they make a great, take one of these roasts, put it on a bed of new potatoes, carrots, turnips. It makes a very good home-style meal. All right, so to do this, what I want to do is I'm going to look right here. And again, one of the best friends in butchery is understanding how this animal's put together. All right, so even if you've been doing this every day, it never hurts to just kind of refamiliarize yourself with kind of how it's put together. So one of the things I'm going to focus on here is the femur bone, okay? I want to kind of cut along that, that femur bone just so that I can remove the eye muscles in a hole. So seam butchery is going to tell me, and I can feel the bone there. I'm going to kind of run right down there. All right, as you can see, my knife will not go any further. That tells me I'm hitting the bone, which is right where I want to be. All right, and then from there, just kind of trace down it. Okay, you get down into the shank here. You don't have a lot of usable meat. It's good stew meat. It's good grind meat. But it's not so much your eye muscles for your roasts. So I'm not as worried about it, and I kind of whittle it off that bone. All right. And then same thing. The first inch and a half of the knife is really just drawing a line right along that femur bone for me. Okay? And I'm trying to keep the tension of the knife against that femur bone, okay? All right, and I look here. Got my hip bone in there. Tracing right down that femur. All right. So then we're almost to the point where I can pull two of those muscles out of here. So if you could see, I'll go ahead and remove the eye muscle for you so you can see all the way. And that's going to be his own muscle. All right. So there's one of our big muscles there, and then I'm going to remove the other one. Okay, I'm removing some of the silver skin from the outside of it, from the top of it, and it's much easier to do when I have a little bit more of a grip on that. But I have another little eye muscle right here, and as you guys can see, I don't even use a knife right now. I'm pulling it apart, I'm exposing those seams. All right, I get to a point where I can't use my fingers anymore, I need a knife, and then I just come in there again with those first couple inches of the knife. Nice little cuts. There we go. My muscle there. And again, none of the recipes I'm featuring are using ground venison, but anything that is not getting featured today, that is going to be the purpose of it. That'll go towards burgers, that'll go towards summer sausage, jerky, what have you, okay? None of this animal goes to waste. Trim around that little kneecap there. So I got a little bit of shank meat left down here, and like I said, that's good for grind, it's good for stew. If anybody's got an Instapot, those things work wonders on any of these tough cuts of meat. And believe it or not, these tougher cuts of meat, these are some of the most flavorful cuts on the animal. Because they are muscles that are working the hardest, they develop a lot of depth of flavor, a lot of different profiles. And if you look at this one here, you can see all of those tendons in there. Those tendons, if you cook them very slowly in a moist heat environment, they basically turn to jelly, okay? And it is very tender, and it is very, very pleasing to the palate. But if I were to try and eat them by just throwing them on the grill, it would be so tough I wouldn't be able to chew it. So being able to recognize what cuts are cooked with that low and slow heat and which cuts are cooked with that high fast heat, okay? That's a big difference that a lot of people don't understand. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and finish our leg. For our chicken fried steaks. And again, all I'm going to do is I'm going to come back, I'm going to remove some of that silver skin. You can kind of see some of that slimier silver skin. That's what I'm talking about in the beginning, that does give that little gamey flavor that people might not be desiring. Finished removing all that silver skin. And again, if I were to take this and stew it for a couple of hours, all that silver skin is going to break down to gelatin. But because I'm taking them and deep frying them for chicken fried steaks, I'm only going to be cooking them for 15 minutes, so I got to make sure I remove that. All right. Alright, so what I'm going to do with this is cut myself nice little medallions. I'm going to go ahead and square this off. That I'm going to go ahead and grind up for burger. I'm going to take a little bit larger knife. Too big. Perfect. And from this eye muscle, I'm cutting myself some nice little cutlets. Okay, about a little more than 1/4 inch, in between 1/4 and 1/2 inch. It should give you a good size. If you'll notice, this one's a little bit taller. Why that matters is after I go and I pound this out, this one being the taller one is going to be larger, okay? All right. So we'll go ahead and we'll line these up, and I'll show you what I'm talking about with the meat mallet. All right. Alright, so I got some nice little medallions out of one of those leg muscles. And what I'm going to do then is kind of lay out all my medallions and prepare them to be tenderized. Go ahead and move my knives out of the way so they don't rattle on us. All right, and then what I'm going to do is I have my meat mallet here. I got two sides. I got one side with little teeth, which kind of helps go in and break the muscle fibers. And then I have one that's flat, which kind of helps with the surface area of it. So what I'm going to start with the little teeth. And again, I just want to get something in a nice uniform size with a nice uniform thickness. And with our fried items, we want to keep it as thin as possible to ensure that it's going to cook quickly, okay? So a nice, by the end of pounding it out, it should be, in between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch, okay? But you look at this. It was this big, that thick. Now it's this big, that thick, okay? So it's really important to understand that how big you cut it and how thick you cut it. If you're going to tenderize it with the mallet, it's gonna, the size is going to displace, okay? So these will serve perfectly for our chicken fried steaks. And that would be the final 1/4 of the deer that I'll be demonstrating today. Again, we're going to feature each 1/4 in a video, and we're going to have an associated recipe with that kind of features a cut from that 1/4 of the animal. And then how to best prepare that. Because like I said before, there's a lot of different cuts in this animal. Some of them are tough, which require stewing or long, low cooking. Some are very tender and very lean, which require very high heat, very quick heat. So thanks for joining me. I hope you learned something today, and stay tuned for the rest of our videos as we cook through this animal.